Welcome to the Divine Law Forum. We are going to be talking about God's laws for the next 45 minutes in the context of the Trinity model, which is a concept of utilizing non-statutory organizations to deliver your gifts and your message or your skills to the people of God, right? So not using statutory organizations like 501c3s or LLCs or for-profit organizations, but instead using what some might call look-alike styled organizations that allow you to bring your gifts to the children of God or to your community, to your family, without being taxed, without being monitored, without the requirement or the necessity for a license. And so we were just ending up time together where we were having a Q&A and some questions that I answer for our members in our community and for people that I serve through Prosperous Legacy Advisors, which is a private member association that I'm the founder of. And we talk about these principles, divine law, and how to operate your life as some might call as a sovereign individual, or I like to think of it as common sense instead of the man-made legal system. You just get together and you make private agreements with the people that you're going to be serving and you're in community with, right? And so one of the last question that was asked, I'm just going to take a moment to address that now before I forget, in that Q&A session was, if you're a licensed professional in this particular situation, the question was, say a doctor, and you want to continue to assist people with their healing, and you wanted to go the route that I'm speaking about, which is to rescind your license, right? So I was a licensed attorney. I have rescinded my law license, and now people still come to me thinking that they're coming to talk about legal issues and lawful issues, and I have that conversation. I was licensed for over 33 years, so I've got a pretty extensive background as a lawyer. And so I can talk about those things, but I'm not using my license any longer. And that's the way that I can rest in confidence that I'm not going to get myself in trouble is because I've taken the steps to let my license go. So I'm not pretending to be an attorney anymore. I renounce that and I say, hey, I serve God in all of my endeavors now. And I don't need permission from man-made structure. I don't need permission from men and women in black robes running black magic as their law, which is confusing for the children of God, keeping them enslaved to a sick system. That's the way I see it now. So I give my testimony, like I'm doing today, right now, on talks like this, on the internet, through my private association. I'm constantly and continuously telling people that we can have conversations together inside the association. You become a member, and I'm going to share with you words of wisdom, but you're a sovereign individual. You make your own decisions. So I like to think of myself a bit like a chess coach, and you're the player. And so ultimately you make the move, but you're just taking input and direction maybe, or input and consideration and discernment and wisdom from somebody else who's walked the game ahead of you. So back to the idea, if you're a licensed doctor and you are considering stepping away from the license so that you can actually serve the people that are coming into your doors with different modalities than are allowed under the Western Medical Association protocols. For instance, if you want to tell the people to try prayer or herbs, God's plants grown from the ground that aren't patented necessarily or sold or approved by the FDA as treating cancer, for instance. There are all kinds of things that you can do in so-called alternative healing centers or with people that are operating private member associations as opposed to through the licensed protocol. And so if you're a doctor and you're thinking about those things, are you wondering, well, how can I do both? This is what I teach. So I teach people how to navigate that journey from the old programmed world to operating in the new world and still keep your sanity, keep your patience, if you will, while you're making that transition. And eventually, I have it, you probably stop seeing patients and you'll start assisting members inside your association. And I'm just going to go through, because I love this piece of the puzzle, some of the benefits that come from that transition, right? So you can become self-insured as a doctor. I mean, what's one of the most significant line items to the budget of running a medical practice? Because as an attorney, I used to set these up. I would work with dentists and doctors, plastic surgeons, all these orthopedic surgeons, all these types of doctors that make a lot of money and end up accumulating a lot of assets are prime targets for lawsuits, right? By the way, that's the whole story, that's the whole protocol of the legal dispute industry and the warring between the doctors and the patients. Like who expects that a doctor is perfect every single time, right? Like who in any industry is perfect every single time? And so we've got this unreasonable expectation on certain professions that if they make a mistake, you get to wipe out their existence. You get to take all their assets. You get to take everything that they accumulated before that as pittance for a mistake. Now, if it's negligence, if it's stupidity, if it's something of this impact, then it's like criminal in nature. If you're not operating from a place of integrity and you do something that's absolutely ridiculous. But if you're in an industry that has a high probability that there's some fatalities are expected. If you're an OBGYN or a heart surgeon, all those things don't go perfect. And if you're working inside of a private association, you tell the people that you're serving, hey, look, I'm one of the best, but I don't have insurance. And I also don't own anything, right? For this system to work the way that I'm describing it, a doctor doesn't keep a bunch of assets in his name. A doctor who's actually serving God understands that the assets aren't theirs. They give all their assets away to their spiritual organization. In my case, it'd be the 508 church, right? Like I would give everything away and steward whatever God has entrusted for me to steward. And so as a steward of another person's life, as a healer, you explain to them the consequences and the potential challenges and all the things that go with the risks of particular transactions or surgeries, right? Doctors do this anyway. But then at the end of the day, you don't tell them that, look, if and when you sue me, you're going to make millions. Like that's just inviting dispute and conflict, right? So the surgeon who's got a reputation for being one of the best simply says, hey, I'm one of the best. And if you're going to put your care in my hands, you're in good care. And there's always a chance that there's an accident. I mean, that's just what happens in the world. This is real. But it doesn't mean that you need to carry hundreds of thousands of dollars, millions of dollars of insurance coverage to guard yourself from that particular fear, right? So as you transition away from owning things that can be taken away from you, you lose the fear of being sued and having things taken away from you because you don't own anything. If they can't take anything from you, I call you judgment proof, right? So now that fear doesn't drive your decisions. It doesn't drive your business. It doesn't drive how much liability insurance you have. You just let it go. And you say, hey, I don't have those things. And that takes a lot. That's why I think a lot of people don't make the transition. A medical doctor thinking he doesn't need insurance is like foreign to his concept. I mean, his mind doesn't work like that because we've been programmed and trained, right? They tell you about that in the medical schools. You got to have insurance. So it's not for everyone, and yet when somebody wants to make that choice, they can go down the road of still being in their LLC or their corporation or their PLLC and running their medical practice, setting up a private association and starting to operate that way. And when they feel ready and they're confident, they can make that transition, and they can stop bringing new people in as patients. They can have new agreements in place to talk about how their association works for the type of healing modalities that they offer. And people that want to come to them for their service are going to sign the agreement and say that they realize that they have no ability to sue this doctor. And then say that the doctor has less people come to them, I guess, potentially. I mean, that's a judgment call for each individual, for each doctor to make on how they want to proceed with serving people. But to continue to feed the beast by covering huge insurance premium payments every year and running that risk of being sued and knowing that you're going to be involved in that legal battle, from my perspective, I'd rather work with a doctor who is not under that type of stress and strain, because I dealt with a lot of those doctors when I was an attorney, and I've seen what that friction and that tension puts on them, and for them to be free to actually do their skill and their craft without that extra layer of burden and concern is very beneficial from my perspective. And you can find these locations, by the way. You can go, most of the time you got to go outside the United States, but you can go to other countries. Well, and more are popping up in the United States, but again, they're not speaking about it. It's like underground communities where you have to go in order to receive services that aren't coming through the licensed protocol channels. But more and more this is occurring. And again, what I want to promote is this idea of really encouraging people to find their healing before going to the depths of the surgery and the depths of the poison and the pharmaceuticals. Like, there's a lot of work that can be done before resorting to that last case or that worst case scenario. So hopefully that answers the question, though, for you, Leslie, that you can be a doctor, still be practicing and transitioning until such point in time when you ultimately feel comfortable and confident that you can let the old world go. And so that's what people do on our one-year journey to become through our Trinity process. When they unenroll from the tax system, they can get rid of their license and operate their gifting from God to their community through a private member association, and they can do all these things within a 12-month period. But it's not it's not super fast, but that's 12 months. Most of that work is unprogramming. The setup and the document part is easy process, comes together relatively rapidly. Most of my time and energy is working with people to have them unprogram and break free of the idea that it continually says, oh, I got to do it this way, I got to do it this way, because that's not true once you know who you are as a child of God, and his ways are higher than the man-made ways. And so we step out of that program and start operating in a new way. All right, so I'm going to transition now and jump into a little bit of the story that we read about in the Bible of Exodus. So I've talked about how this divine law form is going to be a teaching. I'm preparing teaching content for the community that I serve, right? This is just, it's gratuitous. It's to inform and educate and up-level the children of God that are studying his laws, and they see his laws as a higher way than the man-made law way, right? And so, and particularly today, although I've said many times, we work with people from all around the globe. God's law works in every country. It might be more difficult in some than others, but God's law is above country law. It's higher law than man-made law. All country law is, or a particular country or state or providence, that's a statutory creation, which means it's fictitious, it's not real, and it's under man-made law. God didn't make that law. So, and a lot of it came out of the Bible, and then man keeps extrapolating God's law to try and explain it or add language to it or add more meat to it or interpret it in their own way. And then this is how we end up with a lot of silly laws. And they're in the idea that they're for our benefit, but they're actually enslaving us, right? And so what we're talking about here is back in the beginning in Exodus, in the first chapter of Exodus, is when we first see taxes show up in the world. And I don't think they called it a tax, like they called it a tithe, but it was Joseph who had been sold into slavery by his brothers, right? And now he was put in prison, falsely accused. This is prophetic teaching about the journey that Jesus was going to go through, right? So he was, his family turned on him, the people in his community turned on him, and gave him up to be persecuted and nailed to the cross, and then they acted like they didn't know him. And this is what happened to Joseph with his brothers, right? So now they think he's gone, dead and over, but he's actually in prison after being falsely accused of messing with with the king's wife. He didn't do it, but she couldn't handle that he rejected her, so she got mad at him and then wanted him to be in trouble, asked her husband to put him in prison. So he's locked up for years for a crime he didn't do, while God's fulfilling his promises and making a plan that's going to put Joseph at the right hand of Pharaoh. Now, at the right hand of Pharaoh, he's in control of God's children. He's the steward now who's going to assist God's children through 7 years of famine, right? So this is where the tax comes in. So Joseph had this dream, the Pharaoh had this dream, and Joseph interpreted it, that there's going to be 7 years of abundance and land, wild abundance, and then 7 years of drought. So Joseph said, well, during the 7 years of abundance, we ought to be storing up for the 7 years of drought. All sacred numbers, sacred patterns. This is God's pattern repeated over and over and over, right? So I'm seeing that what Joseph did was take God's abundance and then store that up for a time when it was known that there was going to be lack. So that's what God did in this original model of taxation, if you will. He had a ruler that was submitted to him save up money for a time when there was going to be lack. Now, that all makes sense, and the people were grateful, because without that, they would have perished. This is what they said. So now, fast forward 400 years later, and the story picks up again in Exodus, and it's talking about this idea that there was a new king in place now, 400 years later. He didn't know, didn't care about the story of Joseph and why all that stuff got implemented. Now, this king is storing up for himself. He's still taking from the people. By the way, there's no discussion or consideration that God said that there was going to be lack again, but they're still taxing the people, right? And to the point where the Egyptians made all of the Israelites their slaves. And they did this with brutality. And I'm going to read a verse here where it says, a new king arises in Egypt who does not know Joseph. He sees God's children growing and flourishing, and he feels threatened, right? So this is what our government does. This comes from Exodus verse 1, chapter 1, verses 8 through 14, talks about imposing burdens on the people of God. And he divides the people. He creates separation, segregation, and discrimination by having the Israelites in one territory and the Egyptians in another territory, right? And so, like when Joseph brought his family up to Egypt, right? They were shepherds. Well, the Egyptians didn't like shepherds. They were like the lowlifes, right? So they put them in a separate area. This was Goshen, right? They segregated them out. Can you see how that still runs in today's world? You can see how we segregate certain categories of our people. We want to put them in these cities, smart cities, low-income housing projects. We want to separate all these people, and then the government wants to come in and pretend to rescue them and be their hero when they're actually truly enslaving them. They're keeping them numb. They're keeping them small, right? This is what's going on in the world today. That's not just the story this is the pattern that God gave us to look at. And I think it's relatively humorous that we're somewhere in the middle of that 400-year journey as in the United States, right? Meaning, if they say our forefathers set up the Declaration of Independence and our Constitution on biblical principles, right? So I'm just gonna assume that that was the truth. And they were escaping tyranny and slavery and all that from England, right? They were trying to do basically what I feel like I'm trying to do, which is assist the people, the children of God, break free from the ruler, from Pharaoh, from the government, which is taxing you, extracting from you, monitoring everything you do, requiring you to get a license, and then not allowing you to pass your legacy on to your children with ease, right? They want to tax it again and take from you again and extract again, even though a great portion of your life was given and your life force energy was already given to taxes, right? When you add up income tax, property tax, gas tax, transportation tax, right? Every time you register your vehicle, this is. I did a little study on this, and they say, that the average person in the United States pays over $600,000 worth of taxes in the year. That's the average, and I can't even imagine the average. And who knows if that's even true, right? I'm going to qualify that too, because like statistics and these ratios that are created, you can find one to support pretty much any position under the sun, right? But we just use these words to paint pictures and draw analogy and analysis to the idea that when we're not paying attention to the nuances, the consequence is so much greater than what we're aware of. And I'm saying that a great deal of the average person's life force energy goes to feed the Pharaoh system. And it's a voluntary system. It's not a requirement. And as a child of God who's stewarding God's resources, not assets belonging to the matrix, you will stop doing that. There's legal and lawful ways to do it. It's a voluntary program. And like the story in Exodus, the children of God are not always so willing to jump on board. They want to grumble and fight with God's ways. God didn't say it was going to be easy. He just said, do it because this is the way, right? Like, don't submit to the man-made system and give your life force energy to that nonsense when there's another way for you to go. You can actually free yourself from that system and you can receive abundance, right? But it's difficult to experience the abundance when you're a slave to the system, because the system is designed to keep you numb and dumb and limited, not to understand that by just serving God, not by trying to claim ownership or acquire assets, but by serving God, he will give you more to steward. So like back to my point about the massive abundance that I experience now, after having been so-called successful in the man-made world, in the system under my licenses, right? I now live in a community where I have no bills. I have no expenses. I have the ability to live in a community that has far more resources than I had in my $1.5 million house that I had back in Babylon, that I, by the way, lost in bankruptcy when they changed the laws, right? They can change laws at a heartbeat, which can change your whole field. If you're playing chess, they can just change the rules of the chess game and you get caught with your pants down, if you will. And there's nothing you can do about it. That's if you're playing under statutory law. That's if you're playing their game. If you're working with the licensed institutions, the lenders and the mortgage companies and the title and escrow companies, all licensed activity, right? They can bankrupt you and take those assets and redistribute them back into the system, right? So that all happened when I was in that licensed world. at the top of the pyramid, if you will. All of a sudden, the cards changed a little bit. The market collapsed in 2008. Mortgages, I had 9 mortgages. They all flipped upside down. I had equity only in 1 out of the 9, right? And then I also was going through a divorce, another licensed arrangement. And because of that licensed arrangement, I couldn't negotiate directly with the financial institutions because it also required my wife's signature. And she wouldn't sign anything because of how, for whatever the reason was, right? If somebody doesn't want to play game, I can't play game. So I was going to try and do a workout and not file bankruptcy, but my hands were tied. So I then go into the system and play by their rules, and they just discharge it, right? That's all legal and lawful, by the way. Can you see how the system creates that opportunity and why so many people file bankruptcy, right? Like and I'm not promoting bankruptcy, by the way. I'm just saying that when you're playing in the statutory world, they give you provision to just discard your debts, right? Like legally and lawfully, and there's consequences for it, which is your credit gets destroyed, but that's really about it. And they use that whole system to keep you feeding it so that you can use your credit, right? It's just, I'm sure we all know on this call, like how corrupted that whole system is. But my point is, once I gave everything up, then I developed a limiting belief that I wasn't worthy to acquire again or to steward assets. And I made it my job and my goal to make sure that I didn't acquire anything ever again. And at first I was doing that from a place of fear. And I was doing that because I didn't want it to be taken from me again. And I was doing it as I was unwinding my understanding of how the matrix worked and how entrapped I had become in all of their systems. And then I realized, actually, as I started to serve God in a new way without trying to acquire for myself, but just serving from a place of service, that I started to receive more abundance, but I'm not keeping the abundance just for me. I'm stewarding it to the next generation. So the money that now comes through the channels that I steward goes into creating villages where there's sovereign food and sovereign water, and we're not dependent on the government, where other people who have different gifts than me can come and live, and they don't need fiat because of the abundance of fiat that comes through the channels I am stewarding. They're growing food, right? Like farmers are the lowest paid people on the number one need in our community, right, is food. That's our medicine. That's what sustains us. Well, air, water, and then food. But the farmers are all subsidized. It's a government racket. They can't make money. That's why they have to bow down and spray poison and follow the FDA protocols and do all this nonsense. The soil is contaminated, right? It's just a big mess in that world in today's, in the system that we're under today. But that's because farmers are using corporations and LLCs to try and run their business instead of stewarding God's ways, instead of stewarding by the principles that God has given us, right? And of course, there are farmers today that are stepping up and out of that system and starting to steward in this new way. And so blessings to all of them. But here in our village, we are doing these things in a new way, right? So the people that are growing our food here, they're not growing it to sell it and make profit. They're growing it to feed into the ecosystem of a community that's living in service to God. So each of us have different roles, and we're not valuing one role as higher than another. Just because one role brings in, say, more fiat doesn't make that role any more valuable than another role of, say, caring for the children, right? So that's another a category of activity in our community. There's been a private member association that's been created where our children, who, if you were under Costa Rican law, would be required to go to school and become a part of the program and be hypnotized under their sick system. Well, the alternative is we create a private member association and we educate the children with divine law principles, how to be a steward, how to operate in the world without using statutory organizations. They won't teach you that in school, right? But this is how you do it. You step outside of their system and you set up alternative ways of honoring God and operate from that perspective. And so that's what's happening in this community. Another example would be the private member association that we have that was created called the Content Club. And this organization is a private member association that gathers together to get the word out to the world. Like in the Matrix, you might call it a marketing agency. Okay, I'm just using that as a loose another way to exemplify what the service is that they're providing. They're creating content like this video, for instance. They'll take this and they'll cut it up into shorts so that we can send it out to people to spread the word of divine law, so that people who have their assets locked up in Babylon and locked up in the Matrix can get access to the knowledge to get their assets out of Babylon and into the kingdom. By the way, you can't do that by going to a licensed professional. I say this every week, right? Like your licensed professionals continue to put the shackle on you and cause fear in you and tell you how if you go down this road, you're going to get yourself in trouble. But that's because they're indoctrinated into the program, and it's the only program they know how to run. And so, the back to the PMA again. Instead of creating an LLC and a corporation or a corporation that's trying to seek for profit, they created a private member association where somebody like me who's got a message you want to get out, like we can donate to them, and then they put together the content and start spreading the word by creating high quality videos and clips and memorable little snippets of divine law, right? Or what it's like to live in a village like this. By the way, the village, it's a 508 village. So we're living, breathing, we're divine law in action in our community here by exemplifying what we're teaching about, right? Quite different than a lot of the teachers that teach about sovereignty, and they teach online, and they're teaching about how to, maybe get yourself out of the system and, submit your passport or your driver's license back to the government, or make sure that the government knows that you're not a slave anymore. Like, I'm not putting down or degrading any of those actions or activities, but what I'm saying is, if you know who you are, you know who you are. And you know you're not subject to the government's nonsense. And you don't necessarily have to make a bunch of proactive steps to reclaim your identity. You just walk in the new identity. And this is what I teach people to do. Instead of spending a lot of time going back and undoing the things that we did wrong, let's just move forward, knowing that we're not only going to get man-made protection by using certain codes and aligning with certain statutory laws, but we're also going to get God's protection because he's going to recognize us like he did the children of Israel when they stepped out of the control of Pharaoh and they took matters into their own hands and started taking control of their own affairs and stopped bowing down, asking the government for a hand. So this is what we're doing. And this is why you get edified and you get lifted up. It's not because you have the right documents. It's because you've got spiritual protection and a spiritual blessing over your life. And so, all right, so back to the children of Israel. I was reading this with my wife. We've been reading through the book of Exodus each morning for the past couple of weeks. And we're talking about how difficult it was for Pharaoh to let his slaves go. Right? So Moses told Pharaoh, and obviously Pharaoh trusted Moses because he was listening to him and he kept letting him come into the court. He kept listening to all of his predictions. And Moses would tell Pharaoh before God would send a plague. And Pharaoh would think about it, and he'd be like, okay, well, maybe I'll let the people go. But then he wouldn't. The plague would come, and then he'd say, okay, I'll let him go. Let's stop the plague. The plague would stop, and sure enough, he would renege on his word, and he would go back to keeping the people, right? This is what's happening right now under the governments, right? Canada, the United States, England, like all of the governments. It seems to me like I don't know. I don't watch the news. I don't keep up with most of this stuff. But anytime I get little inputs and snippets from people around the globe, it seems to me like the governments are doing their best to trap the people into their smart cities and capture their energy. They're promising handouts. They've already started this, right? Before I left the United States 3 years ago, they were just sending money to us, to the slaves, so that we would see relief. And where are we going to look for it? From the government, right? So that we stop taking responsibility over our own lives and we think that, well, we're just going to be taken care of. We move into these smart cities and they're going to do all the things for us. And they're going to make it really convenient for a lot of people. And a lot of slaves are going to get locked down in those camps. They're going to look different than the camps of old, but that's what those are going to be. And so in today's world, I'm speaking to those children of God who see what I'm speaking about. And if you think that you're going to navigate that inside of a big city, I'm all ears. Well, actually, I don't know that I want to hear about it, because I'm going to liken the story to what God said back in Exodus, which is that we are to leave. We are to get out from underneath the control of Pharaoh. And it's the big cities where Pharaoh has the most control, where the surveillance is so intense, where there's cameras, I don't know how many cameras at every intersection now in the big cities, right? Where the facial recognition, which has started, I just got my fingertips taken. I was traveling through Panama on my way to Florida to speak at an event, and I've always refused to do any of the facial recognition scan or the body scans, and for the first time, I was told I was going to get turned around and sent back if I didn't submit to their fingertip scan, or their fingertip, because our layover in Panama was 11 hours. I just wanted to go outside the gate to sleep and then come back to continue. I've never tried to go through the border at Panama, and Panama made it very clear. It took me about an hour having conversations trying to tell them why I wasn't going to do the thing, when I finally just got worn down to say, I'm just going to do the thing. Just for convenience of travel. It was just, anyway, my point in telling you that story is that I'm not one who quickly just does the thing. I never wore a mask. I wore a mask one time, actually, the very first time I was told to, because I wasn't thinking. But I never did it after that. I had the police called on me several times. I got refused business often. I was discriminated worse than I'd ever been discriminated for in my life. Because I wouldn't wear a mask. It was crazy. So, I never took any of the shots. I never even went, none of that stuff. So my point is, even now, they're getting more and more strict. And I think some of us are numb to what they're doing because they've been doing it for so long that it's become expected that the government's going to get in your business. And so if you don't want the government in your business, my perception is you need to get out of the big city. You need to live on land that's not going to be under that control. And so this is where we put our resources. This is why I'm doing what I'm doing. We're generating resources in order to build places where people can leave the big cities and live in harmony with the land, with their Father, with the Creator, the way that it was intended, growing your own food with clean water. And so if you haven't started to make that plan to pack your bags and move out of the big city, I'm going to encourage you to do that as a potential next step for you in divine law in action. And if you are in a big city or you're in a suburb, you're rooted, you're not going anywhere, then I'm going to encourage you to remove all of your assets from your name, transfer them into a ecclesiastical private trust, not a statutory trust. You don't get that from your attorney. And release your grasp, your grip on the things that you own and get in right alignment with the Creator and call yourself a steward or a trustee of the things that God's entrusted to you. That's going to be a step in the right direction and keep them out of the control and grasp and clamps of Pharaoh. And so, okay, with that, we've got 2 minutes left. So I'm going to wrap us up by just telling this little story. So I'm going to talk about this little comparison I have about how with Babylon's in Babylon, it takes what God intended for good and it turns it into a trick, black magic, and it enslaves the children of God. And when an individual wakes up from that and they realize that that's what's going on, you can go to the scriptures and you can be edified and lifted up on your journey out of Babylon. And it's not going to take you 40 years if you connect with people who are on that journey already. You can join in with the tribe. That would be us, Earth Waking Village, Prosperous Legacy Advisors, right? So you can go to these channels. You can go to divinelaw.com and you can get connected to our community by becoming a member of Prosperous Legacy Advisors. You can sign up for our next master class when we're going to talk about this at greater depth and how you can start to create your own system and plan to leave Babylon and find yourself in the promised land. And so with that, I'm going to say adios for now, which is may God be with you, and we'll see you next time.